my role in initiating this group. And it was, I can confess it was my idea, but I also have to tell you, I think you should know that, if you don't already, that ideas, even good ones, are useless unless you are willing to share them and let other people take ownership of them. So the idea was that the footwear biomechanics group or community is growing, but it's very dispersed. And wouldn't it be good if there was some kind of organization that would provide a focal point for that community? But it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had input and help from a lot of people like Benno, of course, who helped us set up the first meeting, and Peter Bruggeman and Kimiko-san at Mizuno, Gordon Valiant and Simon Luthi were able to scrabble some money from their employers. Ned had a lot of input too. And some of our sponsors like Nike and Adidas and Mizuno have been with us from the very beginning. So I'd really like to thank all those people and the many others that contributed to it. They were taking quite a risk. These companies were putting money into a group that didn't exist and investing in meetings that might not happen. So, but because they were willing to take those risks and take on the ideas of their own, it worked out. There's more due to their input than more to their effort than it is to mine that we are here today. So, science, pseudoscience, and footwear science. So I was motivated to talk about this, just reviewing some notes and going back to the 2011 meeting in Turbin that Stefan Grell organised, and where we had the 3 days were dominated by talk of barefoot and minimal shoes and unstable footwear. And it was just interesting to look at what happened there. It's not that there's anything new about minimal shoes. They've been around for a long time. And the idea of barefoot wasn't new either. Bramble and Lieberman had first started talking about it in 2004. But it wasn't until about 2011 that the footwear industry started getting into minimal shoes, some parts of the footwear industry. And it peaked in 2011, 2012, and then by 2013, minimal shoes or barefoot was gone, and maximal shoes, where the Hokas were already there and on their way up the ladder. Personally, I think that the whole minimalism was, there's a legacy that I think is good and important, but personally I think minimalism was more an economic trend than it was a functional trend. It was more about the record high oil prices, making materials very expensive. It was about guaranteed wage increases in China, implementing every year, making it very difficult to maintain low prices. And in order to maintain prices, the brands needed to make shoes with less stuff in them. I think I was good to see that, but it was economically driven rather than functional. At the same time, so sorry, this is just saying that, so the idea of minimalism wasn't new. It's been around for a long time. And it was the economic trend that really brought that wave. And then they went away just as quickly. But at the same time, we had this trend for unstable shoes. This was the even briefer bubble, unstable rocker sole shoes. They were promoted falsely as muscle toning, body shaping, and weight loss tools. And again, they disappeared even more quickly than the barefoot things today. So now we know that Lieberman's hypotheses have pretty much all been debunked. His latest paper in Nature says that we are born to throw, and no mention of it's all about shoulder mechanics, nothing to do with running anymore. And most of the arguments that in our community, most of the arguments that are made for promoting barefoot running as natural have been pretty much dismissed. But this was all after the fact. And at the time, all the questions that we had about the functionality of these products were resolved not by the scientists, but rather by the lawyers. And we shouldn't simply, some of my slides are going to be blank, so don't worry about that. So we shouldn't simply dismiss this, I think, as a trend that went bust, because the real harm was done. People got injured, people got defrauded of their money, companies paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for false advertising and settling claims of personal injury, fraudulent product claims, and so on. Some of them went bust. Innocent people lost their jobs. This wasn't just this is a human issue, not just a footwear or legal issue. And while this community was very heavily engaged in both trends, I have to question whether we were relevant, or whether we were just following at some distance consumer trends and marketing-driven trends. For sure, our attention bounced pretty much overnight from talking about the roles of cushioning and stability in injury prevention to the virtues of barefoot, uncushioned and unstable shoes, largely ignoring their injurious consequences. And they disappeared from our agenda pretty much just as quickly. I have to wonder, were we really that desperate for new paradigms that we could jump into these things and really not stand up and challenge them? So we need to talk. Close the doors, nobody's leaving. I think I had the perfect intro happened last week when the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, said that, basically made a statement that Australian law outweighs the laws of mathematics. And we live in an era where people are quite willing to deny, politicians are willing to deny science. They're willing to promote alternative facts, which are not facts, they are unsupported hypotheses. And where there are conspiracy theories and an epidemic of fake news. Why should we worry about that? Well, we do work in a field where science and consumer marketing are commingled. That's inevitable. So I think it's a good time to look at our role and look at how, as scientists, or those of us who are scientists, and look at our responsibilities to both the manufacturers and to consumers. So the context of our work is not just the domain of scientists. Biomechanics encompasses not just the scientific elements, but there are also engineers, material scientists, medical practitioners, mathematicians, and others who are not necessarily bound by the scientific method in the same way that we are. We need to communicate across all of these domains. When we move from biomechanics to footwear biomechanics, now we have another layer of discipline. We had an inclusive definition of footwear science. It would include psychology, social behavior sciences, anthropology, and others, as well as the biological and physical sciences. In the outer loop, the footwear industry provides most of the context and most of the funding for what we do, bringing other skills, designers, developers, more material scientists, marketers, and other professionals into our community. And we have to, as scientists doing biomechanics or biomechanists doing science, we need to communicate this with these people and understand that while we are constrained by scientific method and the rules that go along with it, the rest of the community, the vast majority, are not bound by those same rules, which leads to a risk of conflict. Now, I notice when we go through the proceedings that very few presenters have identified a potential conflicts of interest. For the record, here's my disclosure statement. And the fact is, there's always potential for conflict. If you are independently wealthy, funding your own research, exclusively working on topics of no commercial or other value, and are not interested in publishing your results, then perhaps you are free of potential conflicts. If you have a job and you want to keep it, you want to get paid at the end of the month, if other people define or authorize your research projects, or they fund it, or if you want to publish it, then there's always potential conflict. There's pressure to conform to the culture of your workplace, pressure to conform to the requirements of peer reviewers, and that's just the beginning of the story here. At the very least, we're all biased by the need to make a living in our chosen profession. Of course, the companies that we work for and who fund the research, they're not charities. Corporate executives are legally bound, above all else, to take care of the financial interests of their shareholders, in other words, to maximize their profits. So in this case, as any scientist will always be in a situation where he has to resolve real conflicts among academic freedom, impartiality, and financial dependence. Now, potential conflicts don't necessarily mean there are real conflicts, but real conflicts only occur if external pressures, financial or otherwise, influence what we do and how we present it. But even so, I believe that we are biased, strongly biased, but not for the reasons you think. One might suppose that when footwear companies pay us to do research, they hope for a certain outcome, and that we might be unconsciously biased to favour that outcome or to interpret our results in a favourable way. That can happen. I haven't seen it happening in this circle, but it can happen outside it. The fact is, though, that the major footwear brands value science as much as we do as an important product development tool and as a decision-making tool. And they make multi-million-dollar decisions based on the outcomes of research. They rely on the integrity of research. They're really not interested in wasting money on pseudoscience. That isn't the real risk, I think. For me, the real risk is that the most common and very real conflicts we face are not related to integrity, they are related to process and to culture. In the business world, not just in the footwear world, but perhaps especially in the football job, the corporate culture is driven by marketing. Their job, and it's a very difficult one, and requires great skill, but their job is to create compelling stories and associate them with a positive brand image. They create heroes and the tribes that follow them. They have to draw attention to their products and distinguish them from competitor products. They need, in order to do that, short, definitive sound bites, not subtle opinions. They need snippets of information that can be distributed through press releases, sales meetings, social media, and these kind of outlets where plausibility is enough. You don't necessarily can substitute for truth. They also seek to persuade by appealing to emotions, not to logic. And so what we see as best practices, they might see as restrictions on their creativity, and often, I believe, justifiable. So we have to realize, I think, as Cameron pointed out very nicely yesterday, shoes are not just functional tools, they are symbols of social and financial status, of peer group membership, of self-esteem, sexual availability, all kinds of things. And in almost every context, including marketing, a shoe's symbolic value is, much more important than the functional qualities that we work with. Somehow we have to fit into this culture. And it's here where I see some real sources of conflict in these cultural differences. One is very straightforward. The industry is driven by short timelines, which means that too often there's not the time to do a thorough job researching new concepts. That's one of the reasons why we were way behind on both the minimal and the unstable shoe transition. Didn't have the time to do a meaningful project. So that means that we often are left with quick pilot studies, low subject numbers, and these studies don't get reproduced or repeated, because by the time we're done, we're moving on to something else. So perhaps more importantly than the timelines is attention seeking. the desire to emulate our friends over in marketing and draw attention with sensational and novel findings. The consumer product industry thrives on these headline events. And it appears from the literature that scientists do too. There's been a couple of papers that have been modeling ways that scientists can succeed, and found that in an environment that rewards fast turnover and high profile claims, it would be rational to cut corners. And this was not specific to our industry, it's just some psychological research. And there's another study, also again a broad study of the scientific community, saying that there is a trade-off between success and scientific rigor. In other words, the more rigorous you are, the less successful you are in many ways. And say this is not just our community, this is the scientific community as a whole. In other words, the people that stand up and claim that they have invented fusion in a fish tank, cold fusion, get all kinds of attention. And there are instantly labs all over the world trying to repeat their results and so on. And they end up being far more famous than the guy at the back of the lab just doing the routine stuff. So, well, are we guilty of sensationalism? A little example from somewhere else. One brand that was caught up in the cone shoe business used to claim that their product increased muscle activity up to 30%. The ads here said 28%, but that got translated into other media as up to 30%. This was, to my understanding, based on an afternoon's work of casual measurements, and the numbers that they ended up using were outliers. And it cost them billions of dollars by the time the advertising standards people and the lawyers had finished dealing with them. So, are we guilty of this? Of course, you would never see anything like that happening in our community, would you? How many times? Yeah, I've got the wrong one here. How many times have you seen a paper or heard a presentation that opens up with a statement like up to 70% of runners are injured every year? There are a few, and this isn't a recent thing. This goes back to Stan James in like 1978, 1980, a long time ago, when he stated that between 24 and 70% of runners get injured every year, and he backed it up with 4 citations, none of which actually say that. And but this has become a meme and has propagated over 40 years. And why do we do this? Perhaps because we are hoping to seek some attention or to make our work important. If we can say that injuries are an epidemic and that we have and we can put our work into the context of that, then perhaps we can get some attention. Now, this statement appears in the literature. Once you get outside that, of course, into the blogosphere, into the Baja media, it gets translated into these kinds of statements, where the claim now becomes between 65% and 80% of runners get laid up with an injury every year, or nearly 80%. And there's nothing in the literature that actually supports these data, but there is a chain of reference and citation that kind of fades off into the distance around 1980, where there's never any real, there's no foundation if you go looking for it. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this one, and we did a survey on the Runners World website to test this hypothesis. Very simple question: have you been injured in the last 12 months? 3 options: not at all, I've had minor injuries, and I've had major injuries. Now, so the context, we have an N of almost 189,000 responses. That compares with, on the right-hand side, n equals 60, which is the larger, the count in the subject numbers in the largest study I could find that was showing injury rates above 60%. So we have, I hope, a more persuasive data set. And the outcome. 57% said they didn't get injured. Almost 40% had minor injuries, and then major injuries, of course, was subjectively defined, only 4%. I think this is an exaggeration. If we use the same criteria that we use when, in my work when we're looking at playground surface injuries and other kinds of injuries, we count injuries as the CDC does, we count injuries as they walk through the emergency room door. If we took that criterion, there's probably only 1 in 1,000 runners gets injured every year. So it really is about how we define the criteria. But what's clear, we don't know what major and minor mean, but it's pretty clear what none is. And almost 60% we could say don't get injured. So how about if we were to, instead of saying up to 70% of runners are injured every year, we took the same license and added a couple of percent and said 60% of runners are never injured. See how that changes the context. We've gone from having a statement that puts our research into this very important context to an opening statement that says, well, there's not so much of a problem here. And that kind of, if you like, can be sensed as weakening the value. Certainly in terms, it's much less sensational, even though it's more factual. The good news, of course, if we could just indulge ourselves a little pseudoscience ourselves. So when we hear people say that over the last 30 years, footwear have had no effect on running injuries, well, we can now say that from 1980 to 2017, running injuries have gone from less than 70% to less than 43%. Of course, that's pseudoscience too, but if we chose to go that route, we could absolutely do that. So, talking about the pseudoscience piece, and Michael Shermer and his Skeptics website is a great place to learn about this. You go on the internet and you see all kinds of definitions, and very helpful ones usually, but here are some classic ones. Exaggerated claims. Maybe the example I gave you is an example of that. Using anecdotes, evidence, inconsistent conclusions. And we, I believe, are sometimes guilty of some of these things, not all of them. Now, when we get to real cases of pseudoscience, like these guys, most of this is legal in the United States. They call it permissible puffery. They are, when they say defy pain, defy aging, defy fatigue, they're actually not claiming that their products will do that. Well, it's just giving you encouragement to do those things. And when they say that you exercising in their shoes will make you healthier and fitter and all these things, they're just listing the benefits of exercise. They don't say that exercising without their shoes will do exactly the same thing. Most of that is legal. Where they get caught up, and where these guys did get caught, is when they start using numbers. And these are actually subjective numbers, but on some other ads they have some numbers related to impact attenuation that turned out to be, turned out that they had been manipulated, and that got them into trouble. So why do people want to use these kind of pseudo-scientific claims? And the answer, I think, is because historically, at least, scientists were trusted That's becoming less the case these days, but at one time scientists were trusted to give opinions that were objective and that would and opinions that would change if there was new evidence that came up. So people try and wrap their claims in some kind of scientific language or pseudo-scientific context to try and give themselves credibility. Sometimes they overdo it, of course, but fortunately I think full-blown cases are rare. The classic sign for me of pseudoscience is when somebody says it's been scientifically proven. Sorry about the font on this computer is getting enlarged a bit. When somebody says it's been scientifically proven, science can't prove anything. You can have a mathematical proof. There's no such thing as scientific proof. We just basically, whittle away at hypotheses and eliminate the ones that don't work until, and make that circle smaller and smaller and smaller. Einstein's relativity has never been proven. It has been tested millions of times, and we rely on it every day with our GPS systems and so on and so forth. It's never been proven, but it's been tested a million times and never been found to be false. That's all but it's still, we can't actually prove it. So some of another issue I think we have, we have, this is related to the corporate culture and the short timelines and our short attention span, is that we don't follow up and we tend not to challenge our assumptions, and we're happy to just kind of not challenge those assumptions and let our work fit into the existing paradigms and move on. One assumption that we make all the time is that every problem is a biomechanical problem. The person that most recent person to join my team, Adrian Palmer, her background is in neuroscience and psychology. I have a request from her for you. She says, please, will you stop trying to measure psychological outcomes with a force plate? It's not a biomechanical, these comfort and ride are not biomechanical issues, they are psychological issues. And the more you study it, the more you find that the biomechanical inputs are largely irrelevant. Let's take a look at another set of assumptions. In 1980, for me, one of the best papers ever in our field, Kavanaugh-Fortune ground reaction forces during distance running. First time anybody had used a real force plate. Howard Payne had done it with a homemade one, but they used a real force plate to look at ground reaction forces in running. And they, this almost an add-on to this paper. They offer some different examples of the path of the central pressure, and we've never seen those either. And those three examples basically showed somebody doing a heel-toe type running pattern, somebody doing a forefoot type of running pattern, and somebody doing what they've coined as a midfoot pattern. What we didn't know at that time, or didn't really recognize at that time, is that force plates can't measure contact. At the instant of contact, the force is basically zero, or infinitesimally above zero. And a crystal force plate, even the best force plates, won't register until there's actually something more than that. The calculation of center pressure doesn't work until you have 10 or 20 or more newtons of load on the force plate, which is sometime after contact. So, even so, just about every study of foot contact ever since has, we have assumed that all footfall patterns conform to one of these three examples. Now, Kavanaugh and LaFortune never said that, but we can just kind of assume that these are the types. And there's this whole, the debate about which is best and which isn't, and who does what. And people are kind of in denial, about what their foot type is like, because they're told by the bloggers and the Baja media that they're supposed to be 4-foot midfoot strikers, and most people think they are. Only 40% of people are willing to confess to being heel strikers. So, and this is again from our survey, there's 166,000 responses. But now when we take high-speed video cameras out to the field, put them by the road, and look at marathon and half-marathon runners coming by, and actually look at their foot contact types, we see something very different. If we go with these classes, the vast majority of distance runners are actually heel strikers, and the midfoot and forefoot strikers are actually outliers. Now, by midfoot, I mean you can't actually make contact with a midfoot. It's not possible. It's really a flat foot contact. But the same kind of data. Yes, there's 16,000 observations on that one. The same kind of data, same kind of high-speed video from the real world. We can measure the foot contact angle. Angles and timing are about the only thing that you can get reliably without calibration. But so we measure the foot contact angles, and here's a distribution of 3,000 or so of them. And what we see is an average of about 17 degrees, and we see basically that the angle of foot contact is normally distributed. There are no distinct foot contact types. There are just places on a continuum that is normally distributed. I hate to wipe out like 10,000 papers that have been written in the last decade, but sorry, that's just what the data says. A sign of a good scientist is that when you are presented with new data, you are willing to change your concepts, your ideas. You're willing to change your paradigms and adapt them to accommodate the data. So here's something for you to think about. So in my abstract that you have in the paper, in the booklet, I listed some similar things that come up when I'm reviewing papers that bug me too, and they include just things that you really know about people suggesting that no significant difference means that two things are the same. That's not true. You can always make two things have a not significant difference by having a lousy method that has no resolution, which means that you can always blur things enough. So you can always make something appear to be the same. And this happens when I've had this several times. My shoes is just as stable as the adrenaline. How do you know that? Well, no significant difference. Great. Well, I can. If I was looking at it from over here, I wouldn't see any difference either. So, it's important that you look at the resolution of your methodology too. And while we're on that topic of significance, significant trends are not significant. The couple of things I'd like to highlight is this idea of controlled experiments. And the comparison of two production shoes is not a controlled experiment. I'm going to give you an example. This paper actually got published, and they also had a test in which they concluded that no significant difference meant the two products were the same. And they also claimed some performance differences between the subject's own shoes and these new shoes with this new technology it was in. And they claimed that there's a performance difference, and of course they attributed it to the technology. The problem is, with that experimental design, new shoe versus subject's own shoes, it could have been the color of the shoelaces, could have been the age of the shoelaces, could have been the difference between new shoes and old shoes, because it wasn't, because those differences were there too, and they're just assuming that it was attributed to the technology. The test of the technology would have been two shoes that were otherwise identical, except one had the technology and one didn't. And I would want to do what my colleagues over in the physiology lab do too. They use null controls and they use standards in their assays as well as the things that they are measuring. So there's, they're not just comparing two, they're comparing a set of standards with those numbers too. The biggest problem I have with papers I review is that so many of the experiments in footwear that I see coming across my desk are not really controlled experiments. One particular kind, a favorite of mine, is the Evericculum trinus, the fishing trip. You have a study where they are measuring ground reaction forces, they have 3D motion capture, they have EMG, they have in-shoe pressure, they're comparing some, and they find, let's for example, recently a significant effect of the shoes on the timing of the second peak in the ground reaction force. And ironically, of the, the 50 or 60 different variables they measured, that's the one that they hypothesized. Now, clearly a case of where the hypothesis is created after the event. When you do a fishing trip like that, what you actually have at the end is not a conclusion. It's a hypothesis. It's something that you then need to go back and test again. Doing the fishing trip and having and developing a hypothesis afterwards to fit the results is not good science, but it does happen. And it's an easy trap to fall into when you are just hoping to find something, because you want to catch, you want to draw some attention. How many of you graduate students, for example, are aspiring to have a thesis that concludes, we didn't find anything? We hypothesized A, B, and C, nothing happened. Who's really excited about that? Well, you should be, because if you've done good science, that's a good result too. We shouldn't be worried about negative results, and we shouldn't be worried about repeating studies. That's one of the things that we don't do so well. So talking about then, just to summarize some of these conflicts. The commercial conflicts that we have, I believe, are not about, say, the integrity of what we do. They're not about the brands trying to drive us for favorable results. They don't need them. The brands that are serious about research, they need good research results. They don't want pseudoscience. They don't want you to make stuff up. It's not about financial conflict. I've been doing this with all kinds of brands for too many years. And I've worked with dozens of different brands. And the major brands like those I've represented here today, I've never felt any pressure at all of that kind. And they never would, because it's not in their interest. It really isn't. It's the small guys, the new guys, that are really the ones that are potentially an issue. So the conflicts that we have, I think, are not about integrity, they are about culture. The short attention span that, where we move from project to project, I really don't have time to necessarily do good science, and certainly don't have time to go back and repeat studies that should be repeated. The risk of attention seeking, which is not just our risk, it happens across all of the scientific community, and it's a pathway to success for scientists. But we're especially at risk because we work in an environment where, where there is a big chunk of the people we work with, their job is to seek attention, and we can easily get caught in that. But trust me, Matt doesn't need you to, package the marketing statement with your research project. He has people that can translate that research into consumer level statements. You don't have to do it. You have to be willing to describe complex systems and complex results with complex conclusions. You don't have to boil them down to the consumer's level. And sometimes I think we do that in order, in the sense that we want to communicate them to that world directly and get some of that attention. It's not necessary. And then that kind of feeds into the last one, where when you think of all the big paradigms that we have, or have had in the past, cushioning stability, and the foot contact paradigms, and some of these other paradigms that we use, the level at which we describe those and teach those is basically at the level of the consumer. They are intended to be communicable to consumers and to describe what we can do directly to them. We shouldn't really be worried about that. It's Matt's job, it's Heiko's job, it's Kaneko-san's job. It's not our job to translate these things. We should be willing to embrace complexity and to develop more complex paradigms. I think the whole 2D rear foot motion thing hung around for a long time, partly because consumers would understand it. And what I don't get is why scientists, specialists in the field, would be using basically the same paradigm that a high school student with a Saturday job in Foot Locker uses in a shoe store. Why would we be using the same paradigm? When we should be, if we're talking about quaternion rotations around a subtalar joint axis, we may not be able to translate that directly to consumers, but that's what we should be talking about. And one of the reasons the stability paradigm has gone bust is because we've never really looked at it seriously, I think, in detail or at or with the right methodology. So I list in my abstract some suggestions, perhaps a call to arms, and I'll just go through some of them. Instead of reporting that we have no potential conflicts, I think we should always acknowledge that there's always the potential for conflict, that these commercial pressures exist, but that we have a way of managing them. We should have a plan for how to manage them. I have, if people ask me to do something that I think is out of line, I will, have ways of telling them that are polite and that explain to them that they really don't want me to do it that way. They want me to do it, they really should want me to do it objectively. But we need to know, and we need to recognize that it's not just in our interests to do good science, but that our industry partners need us to do good science, they benefit from it too. And that when we prioritize the needs of the consumer and do a good job, everybody wins. In this field, one of the huge issues we have is repeatability, reproducibility. There's so many one-off studies that get quoted and become memes, and nobody ever goes back and repeats those. Part of it's our education system. Everybody who needs to do, doing their PhD wants to do original research. Remember, you're just getting a driver's license. Hopefully your PhD thesis will be the worst piece of research you ever do. Everything you do after that should be better. But I would personally like to see students, especially master's students, encouraged to repeat other people's experiments and important ones, and learn from them. And those in other scientific communities, if somebody in physics comes up with a finding within weeks, there are 40 labs around the world repeating those studies and checking the results. Same thing to a slightly lesser extent in physiology, but certainly in biochemistry and molecular biology. One lab produces a result, the rest of the world is repeating it within weeks. We don't need to work on that time frame, but we should be very concerned about repeatability and reproducibility. Some of this comes down to people like us, those old guys who are doing the peer review. We should be more rigorous, but we should also be sympathetic to negative results, negative findings, because those are important too. And when we see errors and we see the pseudoscience, if you like, then we should call it out. I'd like to actually give a quick call out to Craig Payne, because if you ever look at Craig's blog or his friend on Facebook, he is consistent over the years of reviewing papers very critically and publishing his thoughts, and of analyzing the statistical errors and other experimental procedural errors, and he does a really good job both of highlighting the issues when he sees them and of highlighting the good stuff when he sees it too. So, if the students especially check out Craig's blog, whether you agree with him or not, you will learn an awful lot. In the bottom line really is, I think, that the scientific method, both philosophically and practically, is the best tool we have for answering questions objectively. We don't always use it well. We don't do our experiments where our experiments are blind. The data are blind to us. There should be somebody else doing the statistics who doesn't know what the conditions are, for example. But we don't do a good job of that. But still, the best tool that we have for answering questions, and we need to trust it. So, finally, I just like to say a few words to the graduate students who are here. It's always exciting to see so many of you, and it's exciting to see how this community is growing. Some of you may aspire to be like Benno, or like Ned, heaven forbid, like me, or like Peter Brueggemann, or any of the old guys that have had successful careers in this business. Don't. I want you to aspire to be better than us. You need to, our legacy is not what we write. Our legacy is what you write over it. It's where it really counts is when we get erased and you replace it with better, more detailed paradigms, more substantial data. Our legacy is the people we teach. It's not the papers we write. You guys need to be better than that and challenge everything that we and our generation has done, and do a better job. Acknowledge what we've done, what we tried, recognize that the nature of science is that things must get better. So don't be, if you want to be like Craig, that's fine. But really, you should aspire to be better than we are. I'd like to finish up just by acknowledging the support of Runners World Magazine and my co-editors over the last 10 years. Some of the research and other things I do would never be funded by anybody else, but these guys kindly give me some money to do research. They really don't care what I do, so that's kind of very, very nice. It's not a lot, but it's just enough to do a few things. And then, of course, at Biomechanica, my staff, Caitlin, Adrian, Eric, and the great interns that we have come to work with us, really couldn't do anything without these people. They keep me going every day. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Martyn.